In 1930, a 28-year-old lawyer from Atlanta won every major championship in golf in a single year while playing as an amateur. Then he stopped playing competitive golf entirely, not scaled back, not semi-retired. He won everything there was to win, went home, and never entered another serious competition for the rest of his life. His name was Bobby Jones, and what he did that year has never been repeated. Not by Hogan, not by Nicklaus, not by Woods. And the strange thing is that most golf fans today could not tell you what he actually won, because the 4 championships he took no longer exist as a set. This is the story of the only true Grand Slam in the history of golf, why it can never happen again, and why the man who did it walked away from the sport at the exact moment he'd conquered it. Start with who he was, because the amateur part is not a technicality, it's the entire story. Robert Tyre Jones Jr. was born in Atlanta in 1902 into a comfortable middle-class family. He was a sickly child with digestive problems, and golf was initially something he was given to get him outdoors. He was a prodigy almost immediately. He won his club championship at a young age. By 14, he was competing in the US Amateur, which at the time was one of the most prestigious events in the sport, and he was already good enough to trouble grown men. And then he did something that the modern game has almost no equivalent for. He went to university, several of them. He took a degree in mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech, then a degree in English literature at Harvard, then studied law at Emory, passed the bar, and practiced as a lawyer. Golf, throughout all of that, was what he did in his spare time. That's the fact that reframes everything else. Jones was not a full-time athlete who happened not to take prize money. He was a working professional man with a law practice who played roughly 3 months of competitive golf a year and dominated the world doing it. Now, the early years were not smooth, and this matters because it makes him human. Between his first appearance and his first major win, there were 7 years of losing. He'd contend and fall away. He developed a reputation, unfairly but not entirely without cause, as a player who couldn't close. And he had a temper, a genuinely bad one. He threw clubs. In one famous incident at the Open at St Andrews as a young man, he had a disastrous stretch, tore up his scorecard and walked off the course mid-round, which was an enormous breach of etiquette and something he was ashamed of for the rest of his life. The reason that's worth telling is that the Jones people remember is the model of sportsmanship, the man whose name became a byword for honour. That wasn't a temperament he was born with. It was something he built, deliberately, after being publicly embarrassed by the version of himself that lost control. There's an incident that captures the finished product. In the 1925 US Open, Jones's ball moved fractionally in the rough as he addressed it. Nobody saw it. No official, no opponent, no spectator. He called the penalty on himself, and it cost him the championship, which he went on to lose in a playoff. When people praised him for it afterwards, he was reportedly irritated and said something to the effect that you might as well praise a man for not robbing a bank. Now, the championships themselves, because this is where the modern confusion comes from. Today, the 4 majors are the Masters, the US Open, the Open Championship, and the PGA Championship. That's the modern Grand Slam. In 1930, that structure did not exist. The Masters had not been invented. The PGA Championship existed, but was a match play event exclusively for professionals, which meant an amateur like Jones was not eligible to enter it. So the 4 biggest events in world golf at that time were a different set. 2 Open Championships, meaning open to amateurs and professionals alike, and 2 Amateur Championships. The Amateur Championship in Britain, the Open Championship in Britain, the US Open, and the US Amateur. And the amateur events were not lesser events. That's the key thing modern audiences struggle with. In that era, the amateur game carried enormous prestige, arguably more than the professional game, because professional golfers were often working men employed by clubs, and the amateur championships attracted the wealthy, the famous, and the very best players who didn't need to be paid. So those 4 were, genuinely and uncontroversially, the 4 biggest titles in golf. Winning any one of them made your career. In 1930, Jones won all 4. He started in Britain at St Andrews in the Amateur Championship, which was the one he'd never won and the one he considered hardest because it was match play. Match play is brutal for a favourite. It doesn't matter how good you are across 72 holes. You can be knocked out by anyone having one hot afternoon. And Jones had been beaten in it before by players he should have handled comfortably. He got through it, including some genuinely close matches, and won it, first leg. Then straight to Hoylake for the Open Championship, which he won as well, second leg. He sailed home to the United States and was given a ticker tape parade in New York, which tells you how big this had already become. He was, at that point, one of the most famous men in America. Then the US Open at Interlaken in Minnesota, in ferocious summer heat, which he won, third leg. And finally the US Amateur at Merion, which is where he'd first played in the championship as a 14-year-old boy. Match play again, and by this point the entire sporting world was watching. He went through the field and won the final comfortably, 4 for 4 in one calendar year, as an amateur with a law practice, playing what was effectively part-time. The press of the day called it the impregnable quadrilateral, which is a magnificently 1930s phrase, and the term Grand Slam, borrowed from bridge, stuck instead. And it's worth slowing down on how hard that actually was, because the modern eye undercounts it badly. Start with the travel. 2 of the 4 championships were in Britain, and this is 1930, so you get there by ship. That's a week each way across the Atlantic, with no practice facilities worth mentioning, arriving in a different climate and different grass, with different equipment conditions, and then playing a national championship almost immediately. Modern players fly, arrive days early, practice on the actual course, and have their own coaches, physiotherapists, and equipment technicians with them. Jones sailed. Then the format. 2 of the 4 were match play, which is the single most volatile format in golf. In stroke play, a bad hole costs you a couple of shots, and you have 71 more to recover. In match play, one opponent playing out of his mind for 18 holes ends your championship, regardless of how much better you are. The British amateur in particular required winning something like 8 matches in a week to take the title. 8 consecutive knockouts, any one of which could go wrong for reasons entirely outside your control. Jones considered it the hardest of the 4 for exactly that reason, and he'd failed at it repeatedly before 1930. Then the equipment, which is the part people really don't factor in. Hickory shafted clubs, shafts that twisted under load, which meant timing and hand action had to compensate for the club itself deforming during the swing. Balls that were inconsistent between examples. No lofted wedges as we know them. Greens that were slower, bumpier, and far less predictable. Every one of those factors adds variance, and variance is the enemy of dominance. Winning 4 championships in a year in that era is arguably a bigger statistical outlier than winning 4 in a modern year, because the noise was so much greater. And then the conditions at Interlaken, which have become part of the legend. The US Open that summer was played in extreme heat, and there's a well-known account of Jones losing so much weight during the championship that his tie had to be wrung out, and of a shot at the 9th where he half-topped a ball that skipped across the surface of a pond and reached the green anyway, which became known as the lily pad shot. That's the kind of thing that happens in a year when everything goes right, and it's worth acknowledging honestly. Grand Slams need luck as well as greatness. Jones got some. And then, at 28 years old, he retired. Now, the retirement is the part that deserves proper attention, because it's usually told as a graceful exit, and it was considerably more complicated than that. Part of it was that there was genuinely nothing left. He'd won every event available to him several times over. He had 13 major championships by the counting of the era, in a span of 8 years, from a limited schedule. Part of it was money, and this is the bit that gets sanitized. Jones had been an amateur his entire career, which meant he had never earned a penny from the thing he was the best in the world at, while professionals with a fraction of his ability made a living from it. Immediately after retiring, he signed a substantial contract to make instructional films and to endorse a line of golf clubs, which required him to give up his amateur status. He made a great deal of money from it. That's not a scandal, and it doesn't diminish anything, but the clean story of a gentleman amateur who played purely for love is incomplete. He played for love while he had to, and monetized at the first moment it didn't cost him a championship. And part of it, the largest part by his own account, was that competitive golf made him profoundly unhappy. This is the least known thing about Bobby Jones, and probably the most important. He suffered horribly with nerves. He couldn't eat during championships and lost significant weight over the course of a tournament week, sometimes over 10 pounds. He was physically sick before rounds. He described the experience of major championship golf in terms that sound less like sport and more like endurance of something painful. He was doing the hardest thing in his sport, at the highest level, essentially as a hobby, while it made him ill. And when he'd finally won everything, he stopped, because there was no longer any reason to keep doing something that cost him that much. That reframes the Grand Slam considerably. It's not the joyful peak of a golden career. It's the moment a man finished a task he'd set himself and was finally allowed to put it down. It's also worth understanding what being an amateur actually meant in that era, because the modern word suggests something completely different. Today, amateur means not yet good enough or not yet professional. It's a stage you pass through. In the 1920s, it meant something closer to a social class, and it carried the higher status of the two. Professional golfers at that time were largely working men. They'd come up as caddies, they were employed by clubs, and at many clubs, they were not permitted to enter the clubhouse through the front door or use the members' facilities. The professional was staff, the amateur was a member. He played for the honour of it, he didn't need the money, and the amateur championships were where the gentlemen played. That's why the two amateur titles counted as majors, and why a man like Jones would decline prize money for his entire competitive life without it being any kind of sacrifice in status. Taking money would have moved him down, not up. That social structure is completely gone now, and its disappearance is the single reason Jones's Grand Slam became uncountable. Professional golf grew, prize money grew, television arrived, and within a few decades, the professional game had absorbed all the prestige. The amateur championships didn't get worse, the comparison changed underneath them, which produces a genuinely odd historical situation. Jones's achievement did not shrink. The category it belonged to was dissolved around it. There's a comparison worth making here that puts the scale of it in modern terms. The nearest thing anyone has managed since is Tiger Woods holding all 4 modern majors at once across 2000 and 2001, which is a staggering achievement and is usually called the Tiger Slam, precisely because it happened across 2 calendar years rather than inside one. Nobody has won the modern 4 in a single season, not once in the near century since Jones. Several of the greatest players in history have arrived at the final leg with 3 in hand and not managed it. So the thing Jones did in 1930 has now gone 90-odd years without being matched in its modern equivalent form, by players who are full-time athletes with every conceivable support structure, flying between events, using equipment engineered to reduce error. That's the fairest way to convey the size of it, not by arguing about which 4 events count, but by pointing out that the shape of the achievement, everything in one year, remains unrepeated by anybody under any definition. Then comes the third act, which is arguably his largest contribution. Jones wanted a course of his own, and with the financier Clifford Roberts, he found land in Augusta, Georgia, a former plant nursery, and built Augusta National with the architect Alistair Mackenzie. It opened in the early 1930s, and then they started an invitational tournament there, which Jones initially resisted calling the Masters because he thought the name was presumptuous. It became the Masters, and it became one of the 4 modern majors, and its traditions, its structure, and its reputation are substantially Jones's design. So there's a genuine strangeness in the record. The man who completed the only Grand Slam in history also created one of the 4 events that make the modern Grand Slam possible, and therefore helped construct the very thing that made his own achievement uncountable in modern terms. And Augusta deserves a little more, because the choices Jones made there still shape how the sport looks on television every April. He wanted a course that was playable for members and demanding for the best players, which is a much harder brief than it sounds. And Mackenzie's answer was wide fairways with very little rough and enormous, severely contoured greens. The difficulty is in where you have to put the ball on the putting surface, not in whether you can find it off the tee. That's a philosophy, and it's the opposite of the US Open model of narrow fairways and punishing rough. It rewards a player who thinks 2 shots ahead and punishes one who doesn't. And it produces dramatic swings in the closing stretch, which is why the tournament televises so well. He also insisted on things that were unusual then and are now iconic, inviting past champions back for life, keeping the field small, the particular obsessive presentation of the course, the refusal to over-commercialize the broadcast, which persists to this day in the unusually low advertising load during the Masters telecast. Whatever you think of Augusta National as an institution, and there is a great deal to say about its history on membership that's outside the scope of this, the tournament itself is a designed object, and Jones designed a lot of it. So the man's contribution is really in 3 parts. He won everything as an amateur. He then built one of the 4 events that replaced the structure he'd won in, and he set the tone for how that event would be run, which is why it still feels different from the rest of the calendar. His later life was hard, and it deserves saying plainly. In his 40s, he began experiencing pain and numbness, and was eventually diagnosed with syringomyelia, a condition affecting the spinal cord. It was progressive, painful, and untreatable. He gradually lost the use of his limbs, went from a cane to crutches to a wheelchair, and spent his final years in constant discomfort and increasing physical helplessness. He continued to attend the Masters, presiding over it until he no longer could. He died in 1971. There's a detail from 1958 that people find affecting. Jones was made a freeman of the Burgh of St Andrews, the Scottish town where he'd once torn up his card as a young man, and where he later said he'd learned to love golf properly. He was already badly ill and could barely walk. Reports from that evening described the crowd spontaneously singing as he was driven away, and it's generally regarded as one of the most emotional occasions in the sport's history. His actual golf deserves a paragraph too, because the record can obscure what he was like to watch. Jones's swing is one of the most admired in the sport's history, and the reason is that it looks almost lazy. There's no visible effort in it. Long, rhythmic, unhurried, with what contemporaries described as a distinctive waggle before he started, and a tempo that never changed regardless of the shot or the situation. That mattered enormously with hickory shafts, because a violent transition twists a wooden shaft, and the club face arrives closed or open depending on how hard you hit it. Smooth swings produced consistent results. Aggressive ones produced chaos. Jones's tempo was, in effect, perfectly matched to the equipment of his era. He putted with a hickory-shafted blade he called Calamity Jane, which had been repaired with binding and is now one of the most famous objects in golf. And by every account, he was an exceptional putter, particularly under pressure, which is the department where championships are actually decided. And there's a quality that comes up repeatedly in accounts of playing with him, which is that he was extremely difficult to rattle. Not because he didn't feel it, we know he felt it enormously, but because none of it reached the outside. Opponents described the frustration of watching a man who appeared entirely comfortable while beating you, when in fact he'd been unable to keep food down that morning. That gap between what he showed and what he was experiencing is the most human thing in the whole record. So why is the Grand Slam forgotten? Mechanically, because the set doesn't exist anymore. The 2 amateur championships he won are no longer counted as majors, because the amateur game lost its prestige as professional golf grew, television arrived, and the money moved. So Jones's 4 wins don't line up with any modern category. And when people talk about major counts, they usually just don't know where to put him. But there's a deeper reason, which is that the achievement is difficult to feel now. We understand a full-time professional dominating a season. That's legible. What's genuinely hard to grasp is a working lawyer who played a fraction of the events his rivals played, who was physically sick with nerves, who never took a penny of prize money, winning every significant championship on earth in 1 year, and then never competing again. There's no modern career shape that resembles it at all. which is exactly why it will never be repeated, and not only because the 4 events changed. Nobody who plays golf like that exists anymore. The sport is now a full-time profession from childhood, and the idea of the best player in the world having a day job is not merely unlikely, it's structurally impossible. The Grand Slam of 1930 isn't unrepeatable because it was hard. Plenty of hard things get repeated. It's unrepeatable because the kind of golfer who did it was already the last of his kind while he was doing it.